wilderness did not exist in America before the Europeans arrived. That's because Native Americans didn't see it as wilderness. Lakota Chief Standing Bear said, "For the Lakota, there was no wilderness, as nature was not dangerous, but hospitable." But the settlers saw in America a forbidding and dangerous wilderness, and they set to work to transform it. Fast forward to today, we now have a federal law, the Wildest Act, that protects over 100 million acres of wilderness. Each year, millions of people visit America's wilderness for all sorts of reasons, like making films. Hi, I'm Doug Prose. I'm a filmmaker, and I love the wilderness. I try to get out here as often as I can. To be sure, there's been a stunning reversal in America's attitude toward wilderness over the years. How did this happen? And what does this mean for our land and for ourselves? By 1890, the U.S. Census Bureau declared that the frontier was closed. There was nowhere left to explore. Not all of the wild places had been tamed, but they were disappearing fast. This worried President Theodore Roosevelt, who was annoyed by what he called short-sighted men and their reckless extermination of all useful and beautiful wild things. In 1903, Roosevelt asked John Muir, a wilderness adventurer and popular writer, to guide him on a private tour of Yosemite. On the trip, Muir urged Roosevelt to preserve wilderness in a grand system of national parks and forests. Muir noticed that the American people were starting to value wild places as they became scarcer and scarcer. As he put it, thousands of tired, nerve-shaken, over-civilized people are beginning to find out that going to the mountains is going home, that wildness is a necessity. President Roosevelt was inspired, and he went on to establish 18 national monuments and 5 national parks, including the Grand Canyon and Yosemite. He also created the U.S. Forest Service. John Muir went on to found the Sierra Club, which became one of the nation's leading conservation organizations. But many national parks were developed as major tourist attractions, crisscrossed with busy roads, and drawing huge crowds who came in automobiles. A road-building craze was sweeping the country, and it allowed people to range far afield as never before. But it was carving up the wilderness into smaller and smaller fragments. A big turnaround came in the 1920s and 30s. 2 foresters within the U.S. Forest Service championed the wilderness cause from the inside. One of them was Aldo Leopold, a great nature writer who made popular the concept of ecology. The other forester was Bob Marshall, who co-founded the Wilderness Society in 1935. He wrote, "There is only one hope of repulsing the tyrannical ambition of civilization to conquer every niche on the whole earth. That hope is the organization of spirited people who will fight for the freedom of the wilderness." The American people emphatically agreed, and in 1956, a new law, the Wildest Act, was introduced in Congress. Opposition from the extractive resource industries and developers was intense. But the Wilderness Society's Howard Zahniser, the author of the act, fought hard to get it passed. 8 years later, a breakthrough came. It was 1964, a pivotal year in America. First came the Civil Rights Act, passed in June. Then, on September 3rd, President Lyndon Johnson signed the Wilderness Act. A bright new day had dawned on the nation's wild lands. Now, the American people had a powerful tool to protect the wild lands that they cherished. The Wilderness Preservation System started off with 9 million acres of wilderness in 54 areas nationwide. Over the next 50 years, that grew to about 110 million acres, within 758 wilderness areas in all but 6 states. local economies with wilderness areas nearby began to benefit. Take the Klamath-Siskiyou area of Oregon and California, a land of massive ancient trees and wild rivers. Clear-cut logging reigned supreme here until it was curtailed in the 1990s. But enough wild beauty was left to give birth to a strong ecotourism-based economy today. Wilderness also gives us clean water, clean air, and biodiversity. But for all its benefits, wilderness is not universally welcome in America. In Utah, people come from around the world to visit the state's stunning red rock parks and monuments. But many of the parks are small, and gazing out from overlooks, visitors can look beyond the park boundaries into unprotected federal land, much of which is wilderness. About 10 million acres of Utah qualify as wilderness, but only about 1/10 of that is protected. Meanwhile, despite the singular beauty of these lands, all sorts of threats are mounting against the wilderness. This is happening beyond Utah as well. Threats to unprotected wilderness are growing nationwide. About 100 million acres are at stake, but the total is shrinking fast. If this land were added to the land already protected under the Wildest Act, America's entire legacy of wilderness would equal about 10% of its land base. That's a very modest amount. It's really modest if you consider that half of that land would be in one state, Alaska. In the lower 48 states, saving all the wilderness in existence would protect just 5% of the land. Meanwhile, visits to wilderness areas have increased 8-fold since the Wildest Act passed. Aldo Leopold was right. There are some who can live without wild things and some who cannot. And Americans still choose to live with wild things. The great environmentalist David Brower said that in saving wilderness, we save the life force, the unbroken chain that extends back to the beginning of life on Earth. For us humans, we began our evolution in the wilderness of the East African Rift, and in the wilderness, we were shaped and we evolved over millions of years. To me, wilderness is by far the best place to go, where we can truly experience where we came from, our deepest roots. And here in America, we're so fortunate to have our legacy of wild lands, now and hopefully forever.